Great. Okay, first off, a quick introduction. My name is Tamsin Himes, and I'm a design reviewer at the Minnesota Historical Society. And just a little bit about my background. I'm from a background of design and architecture preservation, and I've been with MNHS for a little bit over a year. I'm really lucky that as part of my job, I get to see so much interesting and varied architecture from around the state. And I have kind of a front row seat to some of the really fantastic preservation projects that go on. Helping people who are passionate about their built history and seeing those preservation projects progress and succeed is by far the most exciting and fulfilling part of my job. It's really, really wonderful. So why this topic? You already know that I love architecture, particularly old and historic architecture. And identifying architectural features and reading buildings is not only something that I enjoy, but I also I feel that it's very important to anyone who's interested in history and their community, or in the built history, built environment in general. I'm passionate about preservation, and I believe that the more we understand about architecture, the more we will realize its importance and be invested in preserving it. So I've broken up this webinar into 3 different sections. The first one is, why does this matter? Is it helpful? Why should I care about this, I guess, identifying old buildings? In this section, we'll talk about the ways to identify buildings and why it can matter to you. The second section will be about case studies, a few different common building types, and sort of the way I go about identifying different features, and how you can apply that also. The third section is tips about where to start with reading buildings and identifying features. And if you've already started, maybe I can give you some advice about other resources or next steps that you can take from here. So why does this matter? Identifying buildings and reading their architectural features. There are many, many reasons why it's helpful, but here are 3. You can, by knowing how to read a building and its features, you can identify a date range, basically, not obviously an exact date. You can identify construction methods and techniques. You can help understand if you understand a building, you can understand the significance of it, and more if you understand what the features say about its construction and its significance in the time period it was built in. Just to note, this webinar is focusing on external elements and features. There's a ton to be said for the layout and plan and the interior design and features of a building. But and those can also help identify and clarify things about the building's history. But that's a whole nother webinar in and of itself. So we're just focusing on the exterior elements. And the bonus is that this is really fun. It's not just like reading a history book or I don't know, boring. It's really fun to be able to discover new building features and be able to identify them in your everyday life. So the first, identifying an era or date of construction. For example, here are 3 different types of buildings that are very kind of quintessentially, they all fit into their genre. The Second Empire. If you see a building like this and you know how to read a couple of the features, then you can say, oh, that's a Second Empire building. It's Second Empire was about 1850s to 1880s. And not to say that buildings later than that couldn't have the same features, but if it has many of the most significant features in it, then it was most likely built within that time period. And then Craftsman as well. There are several features, and we're actually going to look at a Craftsman building, a couple of them actually later on. But if you see a couple of these really distinct features, then you can say, oh, this is early 20th century, 1905-ish to 1930-ish. And then the third is Queen Anne. So same thing. This one is very quintessentially Queen Anne with the asymmetry and the gables, the bay windows, the covered porch and entrance. So if you see those and a couple of other identifying features, then you can say pretty well that this is between 1880 and 1910. And one thing too that's helpful about this, if you have a building that needs significant preservation, then obviously you should be working with a historic architect who has expertise in this. But for kind of common or and curiosity makes it seem sort of not important, but for non-big preservation projects or for just learning about your building, these are really helpful ways to understand more about its history. So technique or construction techniques and methods. So clues about these can be, you can understand more about them if you understand the date of the building and understand how to read it. And this could include lath and plaster, which is here on the left, roofing materials and techniques that were common in the date or era where your building was built, stone and masonry, other exterior cladding. And there are several reasons why this is really important. One, in preservation, we take really seriously that a building should be preserved or in some cases, if there's a lot of damage, then it needs to be reconstructed, or areas of it need to be reconstructed. And we take really seriously using the same type of materials and the same aesthetics that the original or historic significant design used. So that can have a big impact with things like lath and plaster, or cladding on the exterior, and roofing, like I said. And also, if you know the approximate date of your building, then you'll have clues to help kind of be aware of abatement issues that you may have, like asbestos, which is pretty important. And then also understanding the significance of your building. Does it contribute to an important time in your specific community? Does it represent an iconic art form or architectural form? Does it represent a change or progression in your communities or the state's history or economy? This is an example of a jewel box style bank that is really, the style is very, very iconic, and it's specific to, well, it's known for being kind of a Midwestern small town type of architecture. So if you know about your building and you know how to identify its significant features, then you can understand a little more how it fits into your community's history and how it contributes to the story of your community. So the second section, we're going to go over a couple of case studies of a couple common building types. These two that I'm going over are widely seen in Minnesota, and you'll probably recognize features from them, from these styles all over the state, probably in your own community. And then I also wanted to make a note here that reading and identifying buildings and their features is not, it's not super cut and dry. The examples that I had up earlier are very quintessentially, they fit very perfectly into their set sort of styles, architectural styles. But most of the time, it's not quite that cut and dry, and there can be a combination of many different architectural styles in one building, and there can be a building that looks very, very Queen Anne, but it's much later. But that makes this process all the more interesting, to be able to kind of pick apart the buildings and become better at identifying the most prominent features and how to differentiate between or among different building types. So there are many, many, many different types of architecture styles, and this is just a few of them, and each of them have different features and different variations of features, and some of them are very nuanced, some of them are very, very closely related. For example, federal style and Georgian style are very, and colonial revival are sometimes very hard to distinguish between the three of them because they're very similar. All of these styles can be pretty overwhelming, but it's really satisfying to just pick a couple, learn the different features that are associated with that style of architecture, and then be able to identify them. So you don't have to be overwhelmed by kind of the magnitude of this architecture, this wealth of great architectural styles. So the first one we're going to go over is Gothic Revival. It was really popular in America from 1840 to 1860. And one thing that I think is more unique about this style than many others is that it was very popular across a wide variety of buildings, from vernacular homes to religious buildings to secular and civic buildings. It changes a little bit from the different types of buildings, but you can see the same elements throughout. So it was very, very widely used. What should you look for in a Gothic Revival house or building? Steeply, so these are a few very quintessential features that you can, if all of these are in one building, you can pretty confidently say that this is a Gothic Revival building. Steeply pitched roofs and cross gables. So you can see in this left bottom hand corner, really steep roof. You can see the cross gable in the very back. One-story flat-roofed porches. These are pretty distinct. They do appear in some other architectural styles, but combined with these other elements, you can pretty well identify it as Gothic Revival. Tall, narrow windows you can see under the porch. Very vertical kind of design elements. And then the classic Gothic arch. This is, almost anytime you see this, it is definitely a Gothic Revival or Gothic if you're in Europe building. These other features can be seen in other buildings, but the Gothic arch is pretty quintessentially only used in Gothic and Gothic Revival. And then decorative barge board. This is kind of this decorative, most of the time wood carving that's under the eaves of gables, and I'll show you some examples of that later. But that also is really very quintessentially Gothic Revival. So here's an example of the elements that you can read in this Gothic Revival home. You can see the decorative barge board on the front gable, the steeply pitched roof line, the Gothic arch window in the front, the one-story porch, and the cross gables. All of these things combined. If there were one or two of these elements, you could maybe question whether or not it was Gothic Revival, but with all of them, you can pretty well solidly identify this as Gothic Revival. Here are two other examples, and I wanted to choose these examples because the one on the right obviously is very elaborate and unmistakably Gothic Revival. You have the barge board, the Gothic arch, the steep roofline, the cross gables, really decorated like many Gothic Revival houses. And then this one on the left side is a little bit harder to identify just because it's much more simple. It doesn't have the barge board decoration, but it does have the cross gables, the steep pitched roof, and the you can see on the left gable the the Gothic window, arched window. So here's the second style that we're going to look at. This is American Craftsman, much later. Well, I guess not much, but very different design. Popular in America from 1900 about to 1930, and mostly this was used for vernacular architecture and homes. So you can see these three examples right here. They're different, but they have a lot of the same common elements. So not all of these features fit on one page, so we're going to look at the prominent front gable and dormer window first. So you can see all three of these. Even though they're different, there's kind of this common theme of a front gable on the right hand and left hand, and then the center is a front, the right hand and left hand are prominent front gables, and the middle is a prominent large dormer window. Decorative eave brackets on the left, you can see those, and then wide overhanging eaves on the right hand side. You can see in both of those images, they're the wide eaves. Another really quintessential feature for American Craftsmen is the exposed rafter tails. So you can see on the very right hand photo, those are the white rafter tails sticking out, and in the image directly to the left of that, they're there too. They're a little harder to see though. So a couple of other features to look for in American Craftsmen: they usually have very large front porch, really sturdy, often tapered support columns along the porch, double hung windows, and a prominent entrance. You can see in many of these three how the entrance is very prominent with a large porch. The one on the right is a smaller porch, but it has many of the other American Craftsman features included in the design. And then also the shallow pitched roof as opposed to the Gothic Revival, which was the steep. So here's an example. You have the large front dormer window on the top, the shallow pitched roof, the double hung windows, really massive, large front covered porch, the prominent entrance, tapered sturdy columns to either side of the entrance, and the really wide eaves. This one does not have the exposed rafters or the eave brackets, but since there are so many other of the American Craftsman elements included, this one is pretty distinctly Craftsman. So the third section is tips and resources. So the biggest thing that you can do to learn more or understand more, be able to recognize more of the historic architecture around you is to learn the terminology. And I don't mean like memorize pages and pages of terminology, but when you have a question about a feature, or you're like, oh, I don't know what that is. If you hear about something, go look it up. Or if you like take one or two features, architectural features, and kind of study them for a little bit. And there are many, many features, just like how many architectural styles there are. So it's a little bit overwhelming, but I think it's easier for me to choose an architectural style and then learn the features that are associated with that rather than going through like an alphabetical list of architectural styles. Good old-fashioned reading. This is, and in parentheses, it doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be reading through through like textbooks. But these are 3 really good resources, book resources. The 2 on the left-hand side are very small, easy to read. The one on the right is a little more formidable, but it's not something that you read front to back. It's kind of more like a resource or a glossary. These 3 are really fantastic to just kind of get started on ideas of the architecture around you and just flipping through the images and recognizing some of the features that are there. And then this is a shout out to our Instagram page. Definitely come follow us. My coworker posted a little bit ago, I think last week, about some other books that she uses to identify architectural styles and elements. So go check that out for sure. Digital resources. Google is an amazing resource. I use it mostly as like a glossary, and I don't try most of the time. I mean, there's a lot of, everyone knows this, there's a lot of unreliable, not good information on Google. So you just have to kind of, yeah, I guess my suggestion would be use it as a glossary, not a textbook. Dictionary, look up certain, if you don't know the definition of something you hear about, then kind of go ahead and look it up on Google. But there are a lot of unreliable and unprofessional information out there. There are also, though, a lot of very good and reliable websites that have fantastic information that's well documented and very reliable. This is one of them, Architectural Styles of America and Europe. So it has images and great, fantastic descriptions of the different architectural styles. And also, this is one that I'm just kind of barely starting to get into, but there are some really good apps for architectural identification. This one is probably one of the best ones. And so, I mean, there are many others as well. Some of them are free, some of them aren't. The best ones, I think this one is like $4 or something, I don't know. Not something big, but it has really fantastic images and glossary and just a fantastic bank of information, and it's easy to use. And then my last tip would be to just notice the architecture around you. Go on a walk around your neighborhood, or just notice it when you're downtown. Notice your city buildings, and then also just your own home. You'll be able to see many architectural features that you can recognize in just the everyday architecture that is around you. Even if your house is modern, you'll probably be able to see elements taken from older architectures, architectural styles, and nods to major architectural movements. So just as a recap, we talked about why this is important to learn about buildings and identify the features, how it helps us understand and appreciate and preserve the buildings and our built environment around us. We talked about a couple of case studies and how to look at buildings and recognize the features that they display and then identify them. And then we went over a couple of tips and resources. I think the last thing I'll say about this before I open it up to questions is that there's this, I'm sure you all have heard this, where writers say they don't know what they think until they write about it, or artists say they don't know what they are seeing until they paint about it. And this is kind of how I feel about architecture and having the words and names to describe features of building types. I don't know what I'm seeing or experiencing until I can identify and name it in the architecture that surrounds me. So with that, I'll wrap up. And does anyone have any questions? Todd, I have not seen an app where you can identify architecture by taking a picture, but I have looked for it and I'll keep looking. I'm sure if it isn't yet, I'm sure there will be some soon because you can do that with basically everything else. But I haven't seen one yet. And Todd, your second question about do we see newer architectural styles coming on with the same frequency as they did in previous centuries? I feel like actually that modern architectural styles, especially like later 20th century and on, I feel like they come with a lot more frequency than the older ones. I think with that though, they're a little bit less prominent. Like, for example, Georgian architecture was decades long that it was the type of architecture that everyone was kind of using. And I don't think that there's an equivalent. I don't think that happens quite as often with modern types of architecture. I think they kind of surface a lot faster and fade a lot faster. Laura, go ahead.
Yes. As far as modern architecture and identifying styles, I think mostly those styles are identified by the architect who really developed that style, who's associated with those modern styles, like Frank Lloyd Wright era or Mies van der Rohe era. And as far as I know, John was asking about postmodern, and that again, I think it's just probably postmodern style. And what that means is just kind of a simplification or just an image from a certain era that creates the postmodern style.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Does that make sense, John?
Oh, of course. Yes, thank you.
And then Christine, it looks like you had your hand up.
Yeah, when you talk about the modern, postmodern, this thing that always strikes me in terms of people who aren't familiar with architecture at all is the style that they know is the one they hate, which is brutalism. It's just a comment, and I don't know if anyone else experiences a different thing, but I just find that fascinating. And that doesn't have to do with a specific architect or anything. It just has to do with concrete and brutalism.
Yeah.
Plus, the other thing, Tasman, quick question is, where does collegiate Gothic fit within you started with Gothic, and I was surprised that collegiate wasn't in there. So
yeah,
that's the second point.
So Gothic and Gothic Revival kind of encompass many, many different subcategories. And I could have gone into many, many of those. I just decided to focus on a couple of them. So there's no reason why it wasn't included, except that there are just too many Gothic
applications. Okay.
Yeah, to kind of go over. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, of course. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I know, John, you're recording this, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And it will be available online at some point if you would like to revisit it. And be sure and join us for our next webinar, which will be in a month.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.